Hey guys, I'm Dave with the Trull Gallery, and today we're going to build steps and storage for this loft bed. A couple of weeks ago, I built this loft bed for my friend's tiny house, and they've been using the step ladder to get in and out of bed ever since. And apparently, it's not the most graceful way to get in and out of a bed. So today, we're going to build them a set of steps with a bunch of built-in storage. Let's see if we can pull this one off. To start this project, I began by breaking down 4 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood. I used my Kreg rip cut with my circular saw to do this. There was a catch though. 3 of the sheets needed to be ripped at 29 1/4 of an inch, and that's wider than the capacity of the rip cut, or my table saw. I marked the dimension of the first sheet and set the rip cut so that the right side of the blade was on the waist side of my line. Then the 3 sheets could be cut down. As the stock was cut, each piece was labeled with its final dimension so I would remember what piece went where. The last sheet of ply also had one large panel on it. I marked out all the cuts from my cut sheet just to make sure I didn't cut anything I'd need later. I started by cutting the 29 1/4 inches just past the layout lines where my rip cut was still set up. Then I set my shop-made saw guide in place and made the second cut for that panel. This keeps the remainder of that sheet of plywood as intact as possible. I reinstalled my rip cut and reset the cut width, this time to 11 1/2 inches. That's wider than I need for the next pieces, but it lets me clean up those cuts on the table saw. You can go straight to the final dimension if you like and skip the table saw step. A few more cuts are needed to finish breaking down the top and bottom pieces, and I made these with my saw guide and circular saw. Off camera, I cut down 1 piece of 1/4 inch ply for the bottom of the large drawer, and I'll explain why that one got a special treatment later. At the table saw, I cleaned up the edges of the side and back pieces. It's not that I don't get nice cuts while breaking down the stock, I just seem to have more control at the table saw, and I rarely do anything the easy way. At the miter saw, I cross-cut the sides and backs to length. By clamping 2 pieces together, I can clean up one end, flip things around, and cut the second end and know that they'll be the exact same length. I did this for all 4 sets of sides. When I cut the backs, it was easier just to set a stop and cut them one at a time. I don't want the fasteners showing on these boxes, so I'm going to use pocket holes in some areas. The entire top step is going to be seen, so the connection from the sides to the top will be done with pocket holes that I drilled with my vintage Kreg K2000. I marked the location of the holes high enough that I can see them over the edge of my jig. I dry assembled the top box with a few 1 1/4 coarse pocket hole screws so I could double check the dimensions of my back panels. I didn't use any glue here because the top panel is going to need to be removed once my drawer slides arrive. After tweaking the back panel, it's time for more pocket holes. The back won't be seen, so this is a good way to secure it in place. The top panel is the only one to get pocket holes on all 4 sides. The other 3 boxes get them on 1 long side and 2 short sides. To prepare the bottom box for assembly, I started marking a line 3/8 of an inch in from 3 sides. My line started 14 inches back from the front edge, since that part of the top will be visible. Then I marked those lines about every 12 inches and pre-drilled the pilot holes with a countersink bit. To secure the first foot or so of the sides to the top, I added 2 more pocket holes. Just remember to drill those holes so they're mirror images, or else you'll end up with 2 left sides and no right sides. Clamping my jig down made things much easier on these longer sides. The bottom drawer is 60 inches long, and a drawer slide for that was about $150. We decided to go with Plan B, and rather than a drawer slide, we're going to use roller bearings. They have a low profile and can handle something like 50 pounds apiece. That's why the bottom of the box is only 1/4 inch. Even still, that 1/4 inch could be a nuisance with these bearings, so let's make a ramp. It's time for the one sketchy cut of the build. I started by adding a 3/4 inch backer board to the 1/4 inch ply with some double stick tape. I moved my table saw outside so I'd have enough clearance for the height of this cut. I adjusted the blade to 5 degrees and did a few test cuts until I finally ran the bottom through, cutting the ramp I had planned. I thought about using my large panel raising bit on my router table, but that scares more people than the table saw does. A little work with my random orbit sander and some 150 grit paper and the ramp was cleaned up. I even gave it a little extra bit of attention at the top of the ramp in the hopes that things would roll smoothly. Oh yeah, if you choose to go with the long drawer slides, the bottom box will be built just like the others. In fact, this drawer will be constructed to accept the drawer slides later if they decide to make the update. I marked and pre-drilled the 1/4-inch plywood bottom with a tapered countersink bit for the sides and back panels. To start the assembly, I put a Rockler clampet square on either end of the 1/4-inch plywood bottom and the first side piece. I moved a clamp along the length of the side as I pre-drilled up through the bottom and into the side pieces, and then I added a screw in each location to hold things in place. Once all the screws had been pre-drilled, I removed the screws, added a bead of glue, and screwed everything back together. Then I could repeat the process on the other side. The other 3 boxes were assembled a little differently. I used a few 1¼ inch pocket hole screws to temporarily attach the sides and top for now. Then I turned the box upside down, added a bead of glue to one edge of the bottom panel, and clamped it in place while I drove in more pocket hole screws. I made sure to keep the sides and bottom flush to each other as I went. Another bead of glue on the opposite edge, and that side was screwed together as well. Next, I installed the back panel. This was glued to the bottom and sides, but not the top. Again, I'm going to need to access the inside of the boxes to add the hardware later. A few clamps and more pocket hole screws hold everything together until the glue dries. With all the boxes glued up, I used my palm router with a flush trim bit to clean up any minor overhanging stock. I want to connect all the boxes together, and to do that I carefully stacked the boxes, lining up their sides and backs just as they would be in the tiny house. I marked a line 2 inches in from either side, and then marked a point on both of those lines at 3 inches and 18 inches. That's just about as far as I can comfortably reach. Then I used a small drill bit to drill a pilot hole through the bottom of one box and into the top of the one below it in each of those locations. And I did this for each set of boxes. Next, I unstacked the boxes and removed the tops. Then I could drill the through hole in the bottom of each box. I used an 11/16 inch brad point bit at each of the pilot holes I just located for the 5/16 bolts I intended to use. Then I could switch over to a 3/4 inch countersink bit so the head of the bolts would sit flush or just below the surface. The box tops got different holes in them. I started with a 1-inch Forstner bit and drilled a countersink hole just deep enough to accept the T-nuts at each of the pilot holes. Then I switched over to a 3/8 inch brad point bit and drilled through holes to accept the barrel of the T-nuts. I made sure to have a piece of scrap wood below my tops to minimize any blowout the bit might cause. Before adding the tops to their boxes, I drove in 4 T-nuts in each panel. A few taps with a hammer and they're set in place. The tops were then dry assembled back on their boxes. With the boxes done for now, I could focus on the draws. As before, I started breaking down the 1/2-inch plywood sheets with my circular saw and rip guide. I planned out my cuts beforehand for the best yield, and ripped down the stock for the drawer sides, fronts, and backs. These were all cut a little wide, and I'll clean them up later. Back at the miter saw, I cross-cut the draw slides again, cutting 2 at a time to ensure they'd be the same length. With the sides cut to length, I took all the stock back to the table saw and trimmed them to their final width. I know this is an extra step, and some may find it a waste of time, but I know I get a good clean cut here, and to me it's worth the effort. I thought for once I was being clever. I ordered the drawer slides from the same manufacturer, and their descriptions were identical, except for their length. On the left, you can see what I thought all the slides were like. On the right, you can see the shortest drawer slide, and it's just a bit thinner. Okay, maybe more than a bit. This is why I don't build my drawers until I have all my hardware on hand. The 2 longer slides are 3/4 of an inch thick. and the short slide is only half an inch thick. And while that's pretty standard, I expected them all to be the same thickness. Oh yeah, and the 48-inch slide came with a locking mechanism. And while that's great in a truck bed, it's not going to work here. So I did a little modification, removed that locking mechanism, picked up some extra screws, and I was back in business. Despite the differences in the slides, they all got mounted the same way. I used a 2-inch spacer to set the height of the slides and set them back about a half inch to account for the inset of the drawer fronts. Rather than trust a measurement, I used a piece of plywood the same thickness as my drawer fronts to correctly set the spacing. A few screws will hold things in place for now, and I repeated the process for all 3 sets of slides. With the drawer slides mounted, I set 2 drawer sides in place so I could get an accurate measurement for the front and back of the drawers. I took that measurement back to the miter saw and cut the drawer fronts and backs to the correct size. And yes, I labeled the pieces for the top drawer since they were a little bit longer than the others. Keeping the construction as simple as possible, I decided to use more pocket hole screws. I set up my jig for half-inch stock and drilled 3 pocket holes in the outside face of each drawer front and back. Once the drawers are completed, these fasteners will never be seen. Before moving on, I gave all the interior faces a quick sanding at 150 grit with my palm sander. Before moving on to the assembly, I decided to add an opening or a pull on the drawer fronts. I created a jig so I could reproduce the same shape. To use it, I lined up the front faces and the center line and traced the shape onto the drawer fronts. While a jigsaw could be used to rough this out, I have a bandsaw and it tends to leave less tear out. I stayed just outside my line and cut out the shape of the pull on all 4 pieces. With the shape roughed out, I clamped the pattern back in place, lining up the center line and the front edges, and cleaned up the profile with my HPRouter and a pattern bit. Taking the time to get clean lines with your pattern makes cleaning up your pieces quick and easy. I like to round over the upper edges of my drawer pieces before assembly. To do that, I chucked up a 1/4-inch roundover bit in my router table and ran both faces of each of the sides and the backs, giving them a nice shape. I added the same detail to the inside of the drawer front. There's no need to add the roundover to the outside of the face, since there's going to be a drawer face added later. To do that, I just pushed my fence back and ran the inside face across the router. During the routing process, I came across a few voids in the plywood. I'm pretty sure this stuff came from the big box store, and they're not known for furniture-grade plywood. There's a couple of ways to deal with these voids. One option is 5-minute epoxy. I mixed the 2 parts together and filled each of the voids as best I could and let that sit for way more than 5 minutes. Let's be real, this stuff really seems to do best if it sits up overnight. Another option is CA glue. Here I'm using some thick CA glue and accelerator. One big advantage is that this stuff cures almost immediately. A void can be filled and reapplied repeatedly much faster than epoxy. The downside is a large void can eat up your CA glue pretty quickly. Either way, these both work and they were both set aside to dry. To begin the assembly, I used my clampet corners to hold things in place and a couple of F-style clamps just to snug things up. Then I could add a bead of glue and double check that the outside faces of the 2 pieces were in line. I also made sure that the bottom of the 2 pieces were flush before driving in 3 1-inch pocket hole screws locking the corner together. Normally I don't put my finger where the screws might pop out, but this plywood is so soft I think I could drive these screws all the way through. By driving the screws in slowly, I could stop just as soon as I felt the sides start to deflect from the screw. I worked my way around each drawer, working one corner at a time. With drawers this large, it's just easier that way, and there's also plenty of flexibility in the pieces until that last corner is fastened in place. A quick check of the diagonal measurements ensures that the drawer is square. The bottoms were cut to size like all the other parts, and the interfaces was given a quick sanding. Then I used my combination square to mark a line on the bottom a 1/4 inch in from the edges on all 4 sides. I laid down a bead of glue on the bottom of the drawer sides and carefully laid the bottom in place. I fastened it in place with my narrow crown stapler. Since the bottom was the same size as the drawer box, I could line the bottom up with the sides and staple one side in place on both corners. Then, working my way around to the other corners, I could push or pull the sides back into square as needed. Once the corners were set, I could run several fasteners in place along the pencil line I had just drawn earlier. The last step was to remove any glue squeeze out to minimize cleanup later. Once the glue had a chance to dry, I came back with my palm router and a flush trim bit and cleaned up all of the joints. I started with the bottom and trimmed off any minor overhanging stock from the assembly. I used the same technique on the front and rear of the drawers to clean up the side joints as well. With that done, the outside of the drawers was sanded at 150 grit. I drew 3 lines along the underside of the bottom drawer. One centered and 2 more 2 inches in from the edge. Then I could make my marks to locate the roller bearings. I started with the mark 2 inches in from both ends and another near the center of the bottom. It wasn't really centered, but offset so that the center of the roller bearing would be in the center of the drawer. The last 2 marks centered the last bearings between the outer and the center bearing. With that done, I fastened the roller bearings in place with some No. 6 by 1/2 inch screws. I started each roller by partially setting one screw on the layout lines I had just set. The second screw for each bearing was along that pencil line wherever it fell. Then I could snug the first screw and move on to the next bearing. I used a total of 15 roller bearings for this 5-foot drawer. Why 15? Well, they came in a pack of 16, and 15 is evenly divisible by 3. I mentioned that the bottom drawer was going to be assembled in a way that they could replace those noisy roller bearings with drawer slides if they chose to. Well, that left a gap between the drawer and the box. I milled up 2 strips of 3/4 inch ply to fill those spaces. I thought that if the runners had square edges, they wouldn't easily slide into the case. To help with that, I used a jig I picked up from Tamar over at 3x3 Custom. The jig is clamped to my miter saw and allows me to cut shallow angles on stock, in this case about 7 degrees. I clamped my stock to the jig, set the angle, and made a clean and safe cut. Back at the table router with that 1/4 inch roundover bit, I can ease the edges of the filler strips. I ran the full strip first, and then I came back to that angled section and rounded that over too. To attach these filler strips, I drew a centerline on the 60-inch box, then located several points along that line for my fasteners. I pre-drilled from the outside at those points, then countersunk those holes from the inside to accept the screw heads that would hold the filler strip in place. Doing it this way may have taken a bit longer, but it was much easier being able to do the layout work on the outside. To fasten the strips in place, I clamped a straight edge to the side so that the strip would be centered on the holes I had just drilled. I also clamped a piece of scrap stock to the face so that the strips would sit flush with the front of the drawer box. Then I could drive in a No. 6 by 1 inch screw at each of those locations. Because this plywood is so soft, pre-drilling into the spacer strips wasn't really necessary. With everything in place, let's see how this drawer works into the case. There's a bit of side-to-side play, but it's not too bad. Drawer slides tend to come with stops, but this drawer doesn't. I set the drawer into the box, added some 1/2 inch spacers so I know how far forward the drawer needed to sit, and that left me with a space in the back of the box just over the width of some 3/4 inch plywood. I added a rubber cabinet door bumper, and that filled the gap perfectly. After setting a reference line to center the stop, and an arbitrary height for it, I set 3 screws into the stop. I held it in place and drove in the first screw. I checked that the height was even and drove in the other 2 screws. I added 2 more of those rubber bumpers, and now the drawer had a positive stop in the correct location. With the drawers complete, I took them out of their boxes, removed their drawer slides, and did any touch-up sanding, and then got them ready for their first coat of urethane. My plan is to spray them twice with a water-based finish, give them a light sanding with 220 grit paper, and spray one more time. Since the boxes still need a little more work and my space is a bit limited, I decided to spray the drawers first and get them out of the way. Now I could finalize the box construction. I ran a bead of glue around the perimeter, and starting with the front corners, I drove in the outer pocket hole screws. Then I moved to the rear of the case and added a few number 8 by 1.5 inch screws to square things up. Then I could drive in the rest of the screws from above. Finally, I cleaned up any glue squeeze out with a damp rag. And then the last 2 pocket hole screws inside. I stacked the boxes on top of each other and loosely bolted them together. I'm still waiting for the correct fasteners, so I just use regular bolts for now. With a 1/4 inch roundover bit in my HPRouter, I eased all the exposed edges. Then I went back and eased the outside edges and the exposed top edge of that box. By routing this way, only the exposed portion of the boxes are rounded. The rest of the box edges stay square. I also sanded those inside corners while the boxes were attached. Then I could disassemble the boxes from each other and give them one more sanding at 150 grit with my random orbit sander. They asked me to stain the unit, so the boxes and the drawer fronts were stained and set aside to dry overnight. I have a video where I explain in detail how you can use a water-based finish over an oil stain, and I'll add a link below if you're interested. The next day I wiped down all the stained areas with denatured alcohol to prepare the stock for finishing. With that done, I give the boxes 2 coats of water-based urethane, give it a light sanding with 220 grit paper, and then give everything one last coat. Once the finish had time to dry, it was time to prepare the drawers for installation. I laid out spacing for 6 fasteners for the false fronts on each drawer box. I'd feel better if these large drawer fronts had multiple fasteners holding them in place. I did the layout from the outside, again since it's easier to see, and then I pre-drilled each location with a 1/16 inch drill bit. With all the pilot holes drilled, I came back with a 3/16 inch bit for the clearance holes for my fasteners. I drilled from the inside out so that if there was any blowout, it would be covered by the drawer faces later. Next, I could reattach the drawer slides, at least on the 2 smaller drawers. The 48 inch slides don't come apart, so they have to be attached in place. I set 1 screw partially in place, added the other screws, and then came back and tightened up that first screw. After putting each drawer into its box, I could add the drawer fronts. I plan to fasten them in place with 1 inch Kreg screws and a number 8 flat washer. The washer prevents the screw heads from being buried in the plywood and sets it back enough where the screw shouldn't penetrate the drawer fronts. If you're as twitchy as I am, you want to put the good face of your flat washer out. These washers are stamped, and one face is usually clean and burr-free. The washer on the left is what I consider the back, while the washer on the right is the show face. Again, this is the face I'll keep towards the head of the screw, in case anyone sticks their head into the drawer to take a look. To properly locate the drawer fronts, I use a few 1/8 inch spacers both on the bottom and the sides to center the face. Once the spacing is even, I use 2 quick grip clamps to hold the face to the drawer. Then I carefully pull the drawer out and drive in the 2 upper screws, locking things in place. Then I go back and drive in the other 4 screws. Each of the 3 upper drawers were assembled this way. The difference for the bottom drawer is that I use my spacers on the side and the top. That left a bit more space on the bottom of the drawer where that ramp is. And unless you're lying on the floor, you'll never see that extra space. Before I could begin the installation, I had to remove a few pieces of trim. First, I removed part of the floor transition. Any nails were pulled so I could come back later with my chisel and clean off the bits that had been glued down. Then I pulled the trim along the sidewall, again removing the nails that just stuck in the wall. I'm not sure why the trim was glued down. Probably just to mess with me. After laying out a cut line for the rear trim, I cut that line with my oscillating tool and a saw blade. After carefully cutting the trim, I removed it and, yes, all those leftover nails. The last piece of trim to remove was the floor transition. And rather than rely on a measurement, I actually set the bottom drawer in place and marked my line. I again cut this line carefully with my oscillating tool and pulled up the last of the trim. Now using my chisel, I could clean up any excess adhesive from where the trim was initially installed. I can finally begin the actual installation. I laid one box in place and then set the next box on top. It's a tight fit and took a bit of work, but once they're in place, they can be fastened together. I used 4 5/16 18 by 1.5" flathead bolts to connect to the T-nuts that I had inserted earlier. I used a screwdriver and an Allen wrench to help line up each nut and bolt, and I made sure to start all 4 before tightening things down. You can do all the tightening with your Allen wrench, or like I did, snug things up by hand, and then use an Allen bit in your driver. Just don't overdrive things. You want it tight, but not too tight. Once all the boxes are in place and connected to each other, it's time to add the drawers. Normally, connecting the 2 halves via drawer slides is pretty simple, but things get a little awkward in these tight circumstances. Just take your time and you'll get them together eventually. With all the drawers in place, the last thing to do was add this small piece of trim. I cut it to size with the miter saw and nailed it in place with my 16 gauge nail gun. No glue was needed. In real life, I did a lot of jumping around in the process of this build. I'm hoping I was able to put the video together in a slightly more logical sequence than I actually built it in my shop. And in case you were noticing, working like this in Florida is not for the faint of heart. It's been over 90 degrees all week, and I'm not getting any younger. I was a little surprised with the quality of the plywood that the kids brought me. It had a good outer layer, didn't chip much, and I never sanded through it. It did have a lot of voids, and there were a lot of variations in the thickness, which I noticed driving screws. Sometimes I'd poke through, sometimes I wouldn't. So just kind of watch out for that if you're buying inexpensive plywood. Now that it's all together, and there was a bit of Tetris squeezing these boxes into this tight space, my friends have access to their bed without having to deal with a stepladder and tons of storage. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video. Was there something I could have done differently, easier, more logical? Drop in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. And if you've ever built a project like this in a tiny house, I'd love to hear about that as well. I've listed some of the materials and tools I've used below, and some of them have affiliate links, and if you happen to buy something, it does help keep this channel going. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give us a thumbs up and share it with friends. And if you haven't already, sign's still not there. Hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. I'm not sure what's coming up next, but should be something interesting. So until then, have a great day, take care, and we'll see you soon.